Long ago, I did a postdoc with Ed Spiegel, who is an astronomer doing modeling and theory. And once he told me that why he likes so much to do modeling in astronomy. And the reason is that no one can test your theory. And it's somewhat similar here. This is the hard part of confronting mathematical models with observations or verifying model predictions. And I would like to raise a few thoughts and points for thoughts, and then we can discuss them. First, why do we need mathematical modeling? So one reason is that first principle equations are not available for the biotic components of the ecosystem that we are studying. Modeling is therefore is a must. We need them. Mathematical models can be used to circumvent observational and experimental limitations. Field studies of ecological processes are often limited by the long time scales and the spatial scales, and also by the inability to control the environmental factors. And the laboratory experiments can help in controlling the system, but are still limited by long time scales. Mathematical models are also useful for producing scenarios for new possible behaviors. Experiments are done on a given realizations. Model can handle many possible realizations and shed light on possible responses to climate change or other environmental changes. That said, laboratory experiments, of course, are, as we emphasized earlier, are crucial for testing model predictions, and more effort should be devoted to the design of experiments that can test model predictions. Now, so we need mathematical modeling, and there are various approaches that we saw also in this workshop. On one extreme, we have simple model, which we may call them Einstein-like, in the sense that make them as simple as possible, but not too simple. That is, to let them still capture essential aspects of the systems. And on the other extreme, we have detailed models that try to simulate the system. And this model involves taking into account many factors and processes, and involve many parameters. And if we think of quantitative predictions, then of course the more detailed the model, the more potential to give quantitative predictions is. Although as we have more and more parameters, we have more and more difficulty to measure them and to scan them in model simulations. On the other side, if we look for deep understanding of mechanisms, then simple models have the advantage in allowing us to do mathematical analysis. And the big question, the big question that we should address here is how to make good compromise between between these two extremes. And I think this depends very much on the questions that we ask. And another question, how to test a simple model that do not give quantitative predictions. Maybe we should look for qualitative predictions like trends, what kind of instabilities a system can show without being able to predict the threshold, the quantitative value of the threshold of the instability, and so on. When we come to confront model prediction with experimental results, there are some caveats we should be aware of. Timescales in ecological systems are generally long, and observed behavior may reflect transients rather than asymptotic behaviors, and we could, in principle, try to study transients with models, but the point is that transients can be almost arbitrary, and they depend on initial conditions. When we look for asymptotic behaviors, then they are, to a large extent, not sensitive to initial conditions, and then the confrontation is more valid. So, and we are going in that direction by making this network of LTR, long-term ecological research stations that are intended to overcome this difficulty, but in a time scale of PhD, we should be aware of that problem. And another problem is the particularity. Experiments are conducted on particular system and environmental conditions, while models that address wide contexts predict behaviors over wide parameter ranges. And that experimental results that disagree with the earlier model prediction do not necessarily refute the model. It should be kind of interplay between experimental and model studies before we can come to conclusion. In the absence of sufficient experimental observation, what can we do to increase our confidence in the model? And here, this is my opinion. Given an ecological, physical context, we should stick as much as we can to a single model that describes that context. The wider range of observed phenomena that the model can account for increase our confidence in the model. And the last point is heterogeneous landscape scale, how basic eco-hydrological processes like infiltration and transpiration depend on the heterogeneous spatial structure that surround an individual, and how far this influence extends. What experiments can we design to study these dynamics and validate or reject mathematical process-based models? So I suggest that at this point, maybe I'll go to the beginning, or start from here maybe. Let's open the discussion, and we can try to guide that discussion as we find it necessary.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, he put it very well. He put it very well, right?
Yeah. Sorry, yeah. I mean, sorry.
No, come on.
No, I mean this slides were reviewed by the other, so it reflects.
Okay, then in that case, I'll ask a question. So you said at one of your slides that the ultimate test was to look if your model would match the laboratory experiment. I think I saw that on one of the slides.
Yeah, laboratory experiment. The idea is controlled experiments to try to circumvent difficulties in field experiments, where on one hand you have the environment is in general not controlled, and also the spatial scales are large. So if you can design an experiment that is on one hand controlled and the spatial scales can fit the laboratory scale, then this is there is advantage in designing such experiments.
I have a comment or a question. I'm looking into the classifications that you have put over there. I assume that what you mean by simple models are analytical models versus the details that are more numerical models of nonlinear system, probably. And, you know, there is a major problem that we are facing, and maybe as a community we have put over the past 20 or 30 or 40 years way too much emphasis on the numerical models The reason that we have put maybe way too much emphasis into it is that we have, we believe that we can represent fundamental processes way better. We understand the fundamental equations driving those those processes. However, we are very limited by the knowledge of the data that is needed to feed those models. Namely, you can look at the global climate model and, assuming that we know anything about the texture of the soil around the planet or the initial boundary conditions or, the vegetation, whatever you want to look at, is, it's completely out of hands. And because of that, even though we have sophisticated models with complex solutions of those systems, the result that is coming out of them is probably not more valuable than what you call simple models or analytical models of fundamental processes that we know how to solve precisely, okay? And we have dropped completely while, 30 or 40 years ago, a lot of the analytical models were used to try to keep under control our understanding of fundamental processes. We have completely dropped that activity. You look right now in the publications, okay, certainly in the type of publications that I read in climate and the weather forecastings, nobody dares publishing anything in that area, okay? And yet the fundamental processes that we understand with them are probably better than with the sophisticated numerical models that can have all kinds of solutions that are not realistic, and people do not understand exactly what they have put in those models and what are the results that they are receiving with them. So I think that a return to more analytical model, to some extent to the type of things that you were showing this morning, has a lot of potential and should not be overwhelmed by the complicated, sophisticated models that have plenty of equations and plenty of processes that at the end of the day, we do not have the data to the basic fundamental data that is needed, that are needed to feed those models.
Let me offer a somewhat counter perspective to that, although I partly agree with you, certainly at large scales. But often what you get by more detailed simulation models are thinking through how, if you have multiple controls on a process, which one is going to be a big number and which one is going to be a little number in an actual context like a watershed. I think part of their difference is we're talking about different scales. You're talking about global climate modeling, and I'm talking kind of watershed to hill slope scale modeling. But there was a good example today in John's talk, right? Where because he had detailed data to evaluate his stream temperature model under a variety of conditions, then the model was actually quite useful for making predictions and helping us understand what are going to be big changes and what are going to be little changes. So I think there's a role for these types of models, but it partly speaks to having better detailed data sets like this, longitudinal stream temperature data and linking those with those models.
Sorry, you can do that easily if you know how important the nonlinear processes versus the linear processes are. That's very simple. So, of course, if you are trying to look at a process that is extremely nonlinear and you do not have an analytical model to solve that, yeah, obviously, the only chance that you have is your, sophisticated model to try to play with. But trying to simplify those models to analytical models that have solutions and look into it, there is a lot of work to do in that direction that has been totally dropped, and I think that that's a mistake.
I kind of agree with, if you allow me a comment on some of what you are saying there, but going back to the title of the roundtable and the symposium itself, I'm trying to think which control experiments have impacted me in my research throughout these years, and one comes to mind immediately. And I will describe it very briefly, but then also point out what is the problem, what are the challenges of doing these experiments. It was done in, I don't remember the name of the authors, in the prairies of Kansas, and was to show that the assimilation dynamics of grasses or any plant could not be modeled just with simple rainfall. You had to account for the dynamics of rainfall. So they covered, I think, were 10 plots or 15 plots, with some with transparent type of things, the other was left. In other words, the plots were identical. They kept the same total amount of rainfall, but they manipulated the arrival of storms and the amount of rain and the intensity of the storm. That was manipulated in large plots in Kansas. The paper was in Science about, I don't know, 4 years, maybe more, 5 years ago. I don't remember the authors.
10, Ignacio.
Almost 10, my goodness, all right. But the experiment took 10 years, okay, and was very brilliantly done. But it pointed out something immediately to the modelers, and that's what I wanted to see, the marriage between experiments and model, at least to me, which I was involved in that type of work, in that type of modeling, and say, I have to account for the intermittency of rainfall. I have to account for the stochastic characteristics of rainfall if I'm going to model biomass incorporation, assimilation of plants and competition. If not, I am done, because the data they publish show, large differences in assimilation. Now, those experiments are difficult to do, and you need funding and patience to do, but they're extremely valuable. And sometimes I think, okay, which other experiment, even if I'm not going to do it, who could do it, in the next 10 years I will solve a lot of problems for us. That particular experiment, I forgot the authors, is in Science, maybe Amir can remember. Knapp and not Smith, it's Knapp and something else. And but Knapp was the lead author, you're right, Knapp was the lead author. It showed a lot, okay? Now, how many of those do we have? So well planned and so pointed, not to a parameter, but to tell the reader, if you do not incorporate this type of dynamics in your model, and you are trying to answer the question of competition and assimilation, you are missing the boat. That is the type of thing. You see, for me, I think what you two were talking about in there is, as long as the model assimilates the processes, it may be wrong, and the key processes, it may be wrong in other things, but it will answer for us a lot of questions. Probably Samuel Carlin had a beautiful quote that say, he doesn't care too much if the model reproduces, doesn't reproduce very well the reality. He says, I care very much about the quality of the questions the model asks. And of course, he was exaggerating there, okay? But it points out something interesting. And I think guides also what kind of experiments do we need. I am much more enthusiastic about an experiment that tells me, Ignacio, account for this process or you miss the boat, than an experiment that tells me, hey, the parameter value is whatever, you see. That's my own view of this.
I think it goes back to a comment Gabby made yesterday, and that is, as experimentalists, we need to pose very clear, rejectable null hypotheses to reject behaviors. And I think in field experiments often we're doing characterization. And I think characterization at the end of the day is futile because it doesn't get at that kind of question. So that might be something that would really help this dialogue between experimentalist and modeler.
So I'm going to reflect on some of the pattern-forming models that a lot of people in this room are using. And I just want to reflect on a couple of things. The first is that despite the comments Ronnie was making, I haven't seen anybody use the kind of model that, say, Naomi could bring to the table to try to address these systems. So right now we actually have a one-directional dialogue in the kinds of models that we're using. The second thing I'd like to reflect on is that if we're really interested in these systems, and clearly there are folks in this room who are, then the models that we're currently using at the parsimonious end of the table are not parameterized in such a way that we can readily relate the parameters to real-world things. And we've done some work, and I think, for instance, this seed dispersal stuff, we've done some work looking at the movement of water. Sonia and Gabby have done some work looking at the carbon behaviour. We can get there with some of these processes, and we actually have some big unknowns. For instance, it came out this morning in terms of whether any kind of lateral motion of water through the subsurface is ever important in these systems. We really don't know that. We've had similar problems with trying to describe the behaviour of biomass in a system that is highly, highly seasonal. If you try to really turn off rainfall in many of these models for a long period of time, you cause large diminution in biomass, which is really not what goes on in most of these systems. So in terms of some of the things we don't know, at least starting from the model perspective, I know this doesn't get to wonderful experiments like the one Ignacio is describing, but I think we really do have some genuine unknowns that currently prevent a really good dialogue between even just field observations in these models, and that could be a way to go forward.
Yes.
So just kind of following up along the same lines, this is my first eco-hydrology meeting. I'm a geomorphologist, and I've just been fascinated, and I really appreciate being here.
We hope you come back after
well,
this
after my comment, you may not be so kind, because I'm going to say something mildly provocative, which is, with all the discussion of pattern that we've heard over the last couple of days, one of the things I've been really surprised to not see are any rigorous attempts to characterize, describe, and you know, in a mathematical sense, match model prediction against real-world pattern. And I don't know why that isn't a part of the discussion, because it seems to me that that's without doing expensive experiments, which I agree are highly valuable. You know, the world is doing experiments for us all the time, and what we need to do is capitalize on them. And to do so, it seems to me, you need to be able to capture the pattern and use them in diagnostic ways to discriminate between different models, or discriminate between how a model gets at the answer. Let me give you a quick example. I mean, coming out of the geomorphological world, the last 20 years has been all about developing landscape evolution models. That is, how do you build river networks in a computational sense? The problem is that there are a lot of ways to build a river network, and you end up with something that Ignacio and others have shown, you know, has this delightful common pattern. So it's not very diagnostic. But at the same time, there is a long history in describing river networks that give you very different patterns. Some are radial, some are trellis-like, some have different characteristics, and they tell you different things about the landscape. I would think that the same kind of thinking might be applicable to this community, in the sense of capturing some of the patterns in the vegetation that you see, using them as diagnostic to discriminate between different models, so that you can't say the two models are giving you the same reason, the same answer for the same reason. I didn't say that last thing right, but you see what I'm saying.
Just want to follow the line, but in another direction, because I think that the dependent variable in all of the modeling that we are presenting is actually the biomass. What do we know about biomass in Mediterranean or semi-arid regions? We have leaves, we have branches, we have dry material, we have the time scale of evolution. I don't know if anyone knows how it's difficult to measure biomass of shrubs. Or, I mean, for grasses it's relatively simple, but for shrubs, it's an extremely difficult problem, and without actually assessing or estimating the biomass, you can't really validate the models, because this is the dependent variable in all these models. I mean, all the models which were described here relate to biomass productivity, isn't it? And so I think it should get a real deep treatment, that subject, and it's not simple to model it within the models that we are developing.
here we come again to this compromise we have to do between simplicity and complexity. I mean, what you suggest is basically go in the models that have been presented here, we start from the plant level and go up. Plant, population, community, going for patch scale to landscape scale. What you are suggesting is going down an organization level to the plant's organs. I mean, distinguishing between different organs of the plant. Of course, this is doable.
It's
in
not
principle.
what I suggested, but go on.
This is doable in principle, but it complicates the analysis of the model as if we still want to address the higher organization levels, right? Like landscape level or even community level. So suppose we decide, okay, we start from the plant level, and then we have to face this difficulty. So my approach is to give up on quantitative predictions. I mean, I'm not with the models that we have come up with. I'm not pretending to be able to predict when will be the transition from spot pattern to bare soil, or from spot pattern to stripes and so on. This is not an information that I'm pretending to achieve. I do want to predict the correct sequence of instabilities, the type of patterns that you can see under different environmental conditions. And this can give you insight into what scenarios the system can take under given environmental changes. So it's still useful, although the predictions that you can make are at a qualitative level.
I suggest maybe take out the biomass from your model.
You need the biomass because this is...
Or assess, if you want to, so it's either, I mean, maybe take another property of vegetation. Maybe take another property, not biomass. For example,
the biomass is in the context of vegetation. The biomass is a very good state variable, biomass per unit area, because you can handle it in a continuous manner, and in this way use analytical methods to analyze the system. But I don't see, I mean, we can, it's not that we cannot measure the total above ground biomass. It just includes the stem, the leaves, everything above ground. I mean, and this can be measured.
I think it will be possible with LiDAR technology to measure it. The below ground biomass is also lot less important than the above ground biomass, right. But I think it had to be treated somehow, and otherwise, I mean, beyond the just descriptive value.
It's not descriptive. It's you know, a lot of mathematics in general. Maybe many people consider it to be quantitative science. It's in a lot of sense a qualitative science. I mean, okay. So, yeah.
You know, there's some really synthetic things that have come together, I think, in this conversation. Thinking about comments on analytical modeling, thinking about comments on mechanistic modeling, thinking about better characterization. I like to think of us 10 years from now. And what I think we're going to have, just like we have the Froude number and the Richardson number and various length scales, you know, the capillary length scale numbers and things like this, we know for many of the constituents, where I see us 10 years from now, we have some incredible transects of ecosystems where we have very detailed LiDAR and many other measurements across these transects. And we're going to be sitting down and saying, look at the root number of this system. Look at the soil, you know, root solar number. We're going to come up with descriptors that are quantitative, that are going to start to be going to give us basic length scales, basic time scales of these processes that have to do with the stochastic patterns of rainfall, that have to do with the heterogeneity of seasonality and El Niños, that have to do with the heterogeneity of soils as well as the average properties of soils. I mean, that's where I hope we are headed. And I think there's been several groups that have put forward some very positive data and models that are headed right that way, and I think that's where we should go.
I am not so sure that I want to go that way. I will be provocative here. I have seen groups that want to model river basins at the 1 meter scale. And I'm going to go to an extreme. I will say that it's almost a loss of time and money. I'm not going to get any new knowledge or modeling, the Orinoco River Basin or the Delaware River Basin at the 0.5 meter scale just because I have the capabilities to do it. Let me finish, okay? I don't think I will have. If you can tell me beforehand what kind of knowledge will I get in the functional river basin, what I want to know is about roots. I don't have to do all the river basin with 1 meter. And that's where I think that, mathematical models are absolutely needed. I agree with Hud in the sense that, if we don't just want to stop, if you just want to talk and describe the things in a general manner, we go out without models. Now, when we embark in models, we are trying to do a quantitative representation. It's true that we have to use variables, that we hope to know how to handle. Although there are many aspects in science that have gone very far. You're right in a sense, but it's also right. Dark matter is not around yet. Everybody believes, and the models are there, okay? But in the physics, and they do this type of things. But you see, with respect to your comment, John, I think it's a point to be argued. If somebody tells me, as I have been told, and I have people doing it, I will go to model river basins with 0.5 meter characterization of the local topography, of the type of plant, of the soil, and I will say, what in earth do you want to do? To describe the function of the river basin, you are losing your money. Now, if you want to study how the plants cohabit in there and compete and so, don't do it that way. I can give you 1,000 better experiments. What my message in this point is, better think ahead what we want to do with the data before planning the experiment. The other one it will be very disappointing, I think.
No, but Ignacio, I don't think you quite heard my point. It was not a comment about what we measure or what scale we measure it. It's getting the relationships, the dimensionless or dimensional relationships between the basic measurable features. It could be like the Baduco curve is a good example. It's precipitation versus potential evaporation. I'm saying that lurking in the weeds, there are these fundamental features that will scale across many scales and will be highly predictive under current and changed conditions.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood you in that.
Yeah, so it wasn't about going down with tweezers. It's saying that we need to look for these fundamental relationships between physical processes and parameters that will give us predictive capability, quantitative predictive capability.
Actually, I think that the type of measurement that you can do, mapping the soil water profiles, for example, in a continuous manner, is extremely important. There was a question, how can we distinguish between different models? So the different models differ in the type of or number of feedbacks that they include. And these feedbacks have, as I said in my talk, they have some of them have opposite effects on the water regime. So this measuring the relation between the soil water pattern and the biomass pattern may tell us which models are better than others.
So I want just to thinking of many times we have mentioned experiments, long-term experiments, or manipulative experiments. And one thing that has come out of this symposium, I think, is apart from the undoubted value of long-term experiments, which we need to cherish and push for really long-term. But the other thing is that the merge of ecology, hydrology, and engineering that we can do in manipulative experiments that are done altering the environment by, for example, planting a forest in an arid place. We saw the presentation before. It was done for other reasons, not scientific, but then it was used very well for scientific reasons. And there are many other examples like this. And this goes back to the discussion that I had yesterday with Sally on how we can do useful things from what we study. It's not just studying them because they're beautiful, which is true, but also to do something that is useful. And I think we need to keep eyes on things that we're doing to the environment as a society, logging, planting a beautiful campus in a semi-arid area like this one, and what are the consequences? And we have opportunities to study those things at different levels. I don't think compromise is the good word in that slide. I see value in using analytical models, detailed mechanistic models, as long as the question is asked correctly. But we should look at those manipulative experiments, I think, that are not planned, but large scale and long term.
I'm going to say something that is kind of trivial, but it seems to me that this dichotomy is basically boils down to the objective or the purpose of what we want. I guess we may either want to understand, identify general principles, identify features that might be identical or similar across ecosystems, across regions, or be able to predict, in the sense, anticipate response to climate change and so on. And I have the impression that we need simple models that allow us to understand underlying ecological mechanisms and general properties and so on. But if we want to be able to anticipate how climate change is going to affect that region in the southeast of Spain, for example, then I need a model that is specific to that ecosystem, and I need to calibrate it for that region. And so I don't know if there is a good compromise between both approaches, but I have the impression that, well, we need both approaches occurring simultaneously because they cross-feed each other, of course, so that we can achieve both purposes.
Yeah, I agree that the word compromise is not in the right place. Actually, I would say the whole spectrum is meaningful, and actually different models are complementary to one another, and we need them all. I mean,
yeah, I look at the workshop motto, and it was written by a physicist, actually from Cornell, and I'm asking myself, when was it changed? When physicists are not interested anymore in experiments? Since when?
They are very much interested.
This is not what I'm seeing here. So there is a different direction between quantitative predictions and insight from mechanisms. So how can you develop a theory of instability without confronting it with experiments?
Well, you can. You should confront it with experiments.
With real data.
You need data, but you may not be. This is what I said before. If the simpler the model, the harder to come with accurate quantitative agreement. So, but you can come up with the right qualitative prediction. That is, if you decrease precipitation, the prediction is that the system should change from that state to another state. And this you can test in experiment and see. I mean, these qualitative predictions are very valuable because they can tell you how the system can respond to environmental changes, even if not the thresholds themselves.
I thought when I read it that he meant actual measurements when he said experiments. I'm talking about Richard Feynman. So I thought that he meant actual experiments, measurement,
yeah, I mean,
physically based measurements.
Well, you should distinguish between experiments in physics and experiments in the life sciences. I mean, we are much more limited And that is why qualitative prediction, in my opinion, I mean, I express in my opinion, is something that is doable, much more doable, and still valuable.
So if those intellectual words, rephrasing Jeff's first title, if these two intellectual words are so different in defining experiment, do you see any way how can they collaborate to receive better models? Because now I think that we are progressing in parallel lines. Do you agree?
You mean theorists and experimentalists?
And physicists and earth scientists.
I don't see the, I mean, first, I don't like this categorization. I mean, there are people who, you know, that spend the whole scale. But it's the point. It's basically going along this line from simple models to more detailed models, and every model on that line is in principle valuable, but we should understand that we cannot expect quantitative predictions from very simple model. On the other hand, we may not expect for getting much insight from very detailed models. So this is and in this sense, this is a compromise we have to do. If we want to simplify things, we have to give up on quantitative information, and if we want to go for quantitative information, we should compromise on be able to understanding mechanisms.
So I hope that
in the complex system.
Just one last.
I mean, of course, if the system is quite simple, you can do both. But when the system is complex, then compromise in that sense has to be made.
So do we want to look for a way to develop simple models that can be validated against field events in situ?
Yeah.
Yes, we do want, but the validation is not in the, well, I'm repeating what I say, but is more in a qualitative sense.
So maybe we could, I know other people want to make a point, and I could just channel for Danny Orr and say that we should try and keep our comments and responses very short. But I just want to make a very quick point that I hope that data is the final court of appeal for our model approaches. And I hope we don't get high-centered on these slides on the board here, and that we have an open discussion. I think for me as an experimentalist, it's what data? You know, you could have 101 model structures of rainfall runoff that all represent the hydrograph, but I could, if I had the right data, for instance, some isotope data, I could quickly reject 99 of them because perhaps they were representing the runoff right for the wrong reasons, if you're concerned about flow and transport, for instance. So I think one of the things is, again, this idea of data data complementary or orthogonal, as John mentioned. And it's trying to think about what's the value of data, what type of data set should we be bringing to be able to reject model structures, and pursuing a rejectionist framework to our models.
I take your point very well, really, because that's a challenge, and I think that's a challenge we face. Because it's pretty difficult, at least to me, in my mind, when I think about an experiment, that I want to see the result before I depart from this world. It's our long-term experiments. And just, I think it's a challenge, it's an intellectual challenge to try to design, even if we are not going to do the experiment right away, okay? An experiment that will answer a crucial question for our own research. The experiment, for example, the data that you mentioned, Jeff, in my thinking is, hey, you already have the process more or less established, and you want to differentiate between process and so on, so you go for the data, and the specific data, and you're going to do an experiment to collect some kind of very specific data. The isotope is a case of that, where the water is coming from and so on. But if now you deal, for example, a lot of the discussion this morning or yesterday, I don't remember now, was dealing with patterns. That, and I think that's what we were referring to. and the discussion before. That's a very challenging thing to tackle with an experiment. I mean, has to be done, but then the question has to be posed and has to be studied. It's a challenging thing. When you think, for example, you ask me what experiment would I like if I were God to run, I will say I want the savannah right now, because that's the point in what I am interested. Some other people it's different interest. I want to study why the patterns in savanna sometimes get clusters of trees could be of similar or not so similar characteristics. How do I do an experiment? Because that's a hypothesis. I may have some data that may indicate something towards that, but you are putting me on the spot saying, and rightly so, Ignacio thinking something that we could answer that. And then I will have to have, suppose I want to have big savanna with the same general type of climate, and in here I will manipulate the planting of trees in different type of patterns. For example, in a self-similar type of, preserving the same density of trees, the same total canopy coverage. Those two things, preserving in both, I can vary fundamentally the shape. And then I would like to measure the assimilation of both savannas to see which is better. Is that a doable experiment? Yes, but it will take a heck of a lot of time, a heck of a lot of effort, people and money to do it. You see and that's the challenge we have. Now, the second part of the challenge, can I think in a way to do that, what I just described, in a laboratory, in a less direct manner, and maybe less convincing manner, but which will count with your approval as an experiment? That I'm not so sure, but I am trying to devise to do it with very small groups of plants.
May I, two comments, one on the modeling side and the other on the data issue. On the modeling side, that kind of dichotomy is not new. I remember that many years ago in Woodsaw, it was coined the fact that the world of modelers is split into slobs and bores. The formers do completely irrelevant things, but very carefully. And the second class cope with very relevant things, but in a quite cavalier way. So that is a very old issue that was already there at the time of Feynman. It's always been there. I mean, how much simplicity you want in your model. You may understand things, but then you lose a lot of falsifiability in a way. So this is always with any time you start to build up a model. The second thing of the data, I mean, we have been spinning round and around the issue of comparing, doing experiments and comparing with existing data. So I think that a huge output and success of this meeting would be if at least one simple, extremely simple case could be addressed by experimentalists and modelers and try to get something to go beyond what has been presented, and maybe presented in one of the papers submitted to, even without new experiments, but just to use the data that are available there. I mean, that would be already a good success.
Maybe I can add a couple of additional comments. First, on the modeling, I want to go back to Ronnie's comment right in the beginnings, that we have to choose between numerical models that are very heavy in detail and maybe go back to analytical equations. And I think there's also a middle way. And in fact, my impression is that the young scientists that are coming up are actually going to capture this middle way. I'm just back from a conference in Poland in this case, and there were a bunch of young people that we were talking about the global carbon cycle, and it was amazing to see how these young graduate or postdocs come up with MATLAB, Stella models, and within minutes put together box models of 3, 4, 5 models, put some pools, a couple of equations for fluxes, and produce very quickly the essence of a system and simulate it in a way that is way above what we can do with one analytical equation, and much, much simpler than a full-scale numerical model that Ronnie said, that were oversold, and I agree with that. So there is a middle way, and I think that there are some new expertise in this direction. Now I want to say also about what the link between experiment or measurement and modeling, and I think it's interesting that the isotope came up in the discussion, because isotopes, and this is just an example of a tracer, stable isotopes like in water, stable isotope in anything else, and not only stable isotopes, C14 is a major tracer. There are other specific chemicals that are tracer. And the power of this tracer is not only in experimental works, it's actually at least as powerful in modeling, because tracers such as isotopes are a very strong constraint on models. If you produce a hydrological budget and you isotope enable it, you have to, the elemental cycle have to agree with the isotopic processes. And if you got it right, you have to produce the right isotopic observation. This is a constraint. It's not just a tracer or something to measure in the field. It's actually a modeling tool. People use C14 as a major constraint for global carbon cycle. There are water isotopes, there are nitrogen specific compounds that are used as tracer for cycles. So adding tracers to modeling, I think, is a very powerful way to go that has been way underutilized.
I think this forum is quite diverse, although many people here are related to the general topic in one way or another. Actually have specialties that are quite different, and I think in this opportunity that people with different expertise come and meet together and put on the table what is needed to do to advance this field, it might be more productive to think about big collaborative project and not about specific experiments or models that each one of the groups of the expertise here can develop by itself. So let me just give a few examples from related scientific fields. Of course, the phase experiments. So whether they are not successful, but they are a big project that were promoted by interested people to address questions and mechanisms that have to do with the interface between models and data. Another example is the consortium of 50 hectare plots in which people count individuals of different species of trees, and so there are several like that all over the world, and they use that to address big questions about community structure that, again, in the interface between models and data. Another example for my field is that now we are arranging to launch a satellite that will provide movement data all across the world in order to examine mechanism of migration, of foraging, and so on. And it's again in the interface between models and data. So and there are more. I think even in the data level, there are consortium or there are big projects. For example, in ANSYS in Santa Barbara, they put together all the data on latitudinal gradients of species diversity in one platform that is available to many researchers. And then people have a huge amount of data that they cannot collect by their own. So I think that this community should think about doing some beyond the local sites of each one of the researchers here, to think about some projects that can lead the whole field towards more broad understanding of and broad interaction between models and data.
I very much agree with that, but one point here, I think I'm going to put a little bit of optimism to it here. I think sometimes we hit ourselves too hard. physicists can do control experiments in many things, okay? Astronomers are in a different type of boat. But we are in eco-hydrology, you know. Hydrology is part of earth sciences, mainly. Eco is a biological science. And those two sciences are very different in terms of experiments, you know. Take earth sciences, you know, take geology, which probably the most fundamental theory there is plate tectonics. Now, to design an experiment to test plate tectonics is out of the question as an experiment goes. You test plate tectonics and accept that it is universally accepted in the basis of evidence that confirm or tend to confirm what plate tectonic implies. And when you accumulate enormous amount of this evidence, you are satisfied with it, and nobody has come up with something that will veto or contradict that theory, and then the thing is accepted. And sometimes I think that we ask too much of ourselves and say, hey, let's design an experiment that will prove this or that. Sometimes it's possible to do it, but sometimes I think we have to go more like this. Sometimes the earth sciences do, in which you don't carry control experiments just with the typical meaning of a control experiment. I mean, it's you go for the evidence, as you say, in a universal, global type of thing going, and this again is very tough. You know, we have to go through data in different places, contrasting that, and I think that's where we probably have been lacking somewhat. Modelers, many of us have tended to, you know, be content or happy with relatively small amounts of evidence, and to continue testing the hypothesis and the models. Sometimes it's not so much of an experiment, but it's to contrast different situations. You know, the Himalayas are there. Why? Well, we are not going to prove they are there with a control experiment to produce the Himalayas or not produce them. It is evidence that leads to that. Continental erosion, these type of things. They are not manipulative type of experiments that easy in geology or even river networks, okay? And I think that an effort also we have to put to and be optimistic that you know, even if if we can do control experiments, fine. And there are cases in which we can do control experiments, and some of these examples have been shown in this conference, and that's wonderful. But there are other cases in which we have to be happy, pleased, and completely satisfied with a cumulative evidence that will, you know, corroborate more and more and more certain processes and theories that we may have, I think. Gabby.
It seems that there are certain problems where you have a limited number of variables that surface. Even though the system may be fairly complex, few variables surface that dominate the behavior that you're interested in. And I think those are very amenable, perhaps, to simplified low-dimensional models that might also be amenable to being described mathematically and so forth. I think we are dealing with problems that are not always easy to identify what variables are going to surface to the top. And in certain cases, the number may be just too big for a specific ecosystem. So I don't think we should lock ourselves into a single approach. I think the idea of having detailed models for specific mechanisms, having broad stroke models that are able to put few pieces together and say, look, this is the genesis of the mechanism is totally acceptable. And I think with time, we will start seeing how to upscale or downscale these very specific mechanisms and why they might look like this in a more simplified model. Why annual biomass might generate, why movement, very detailed hydrologic movements might look quasi-linear in Ehud's model. I mean, this will come with time if this is really the only mechanism that's important. The other thing is that there's been some successes in our fields, in earth sciences. So for example, if I take Monin on a book of similarity theory, it was proposed in the 30s based on dimensional considerations of the turbulent kinetic energy budget. And there's been few experiments in Australia that actually showed, yes, this might work. And then when the Kansas experiment came, it suggested, yes, this is truly the way a very complicated problem, turbulence, does have very few variables to describe the statistics of the flow. And when the experiment was repeated in Minnesota, everybody was ecstatic that the numbers turn out to be the same. And that actually held ground for 60 years now.
And coming to that, I completely agree with you, I think, and that, but again, but I will go further. I think that reinforces the usefulness of mathematical modeling, very much so. And I think you agree with that. But not only that, you know, I remember years ago, Jim Doug, in one conversation, told me, you know, one of the problems that hydrology will face sooner or later is that we will never have a Reynolds number, a Froude number, a Webb number, and etc., to make models to test simply in a laboratory, you know. Our things frequently, not always, are much more complicated because we don't even know the variables that are playing a role.
The variables that
Exactly.
we don't know what variables their surface. The success of Fonin and Abukov similarity theory is that they were able to identify the variables that impact the flow, and they actually guided the experiments.
Absolutely. And then, you know, even if one recognizes sometimes the enormous complexity of a problem, again, I think physicists have been extremely successful also pointing out, you know, there are cases in which the mean field approach works. There are cases in which the mean field approach does not work. But there are cases where it works. And you know, there are some philosophies in science more or less established to pursue some kind of statistical mechanics. Is a very rich discipline for this. And you know, in trying to simplify, at least giving a framework of mind to simplify the approach to some problems. So I agree with you, there is some optimism and there are some success stories. But my point was not to always think to try, hey, I have to demonstrate this quickly with some kind of experiment in the classical role of an experiment, okay? Because that may not be possible sometimes in the earth sciences.
I want to ask the audience if there's one state variable, response variable, that is common and most important for all of you. What is that?
Money.
What do you want to understand? What do you want to learn? What is that? What? The flow of water?
The system you're studying and the questions you're asking. I mean, you cannot...
I think it is soil moisture.
What is that?
It is a semi-arid system, so it is soil moisture. I would propose it is soil moisture.
I would disagree. I would say it's biomass rather than soil moisture, or evaporative flux. If you care about water resources, it's evaporative flux. If you care about carbon cycling or ecosystem habitat, it's biomass.
Any more? Soil moisture, biomass, and what are the three, say,
species diversity?
Yeah, variables that explain this, the variation in these two?
Species diversity and species composition.
So go and measure them. Put systems and go and measure these variables and put the system around the world. And here you have an international workshop, international project that can further advance this field. As simple as that.
But that's not as simple as that. I agree with no, just a second, you know. I agree with America saying soil moisture. Now I turn the question to you. Go and measure soil moisture, you know, in the I don't know, in the Argentina pampas, you know, and or whatever, in a river basin or a semi-arid river basin, and it will vary dramatically. Now you will say, wonderful. I will have to characterize the variation. Point, just a second. Then the thing here is where mathematical modeling helps you a lot, because mathematical modeling will at least guide you with the frequency and the spatial sampling of soil moisture you have to do to characterize. That probably is an old one. Rainfall is a very important variable. But I will suggest we do have a pretty good handle of the errors we make when we try to characterize space-time rainfall with the instrument we have right now.
Ignacio, I would argue that this variation is not infinite. There are a limited number in the end of factors and conditions that you need to measure in order to understand the system.
Well, I perfectly agree with you, and this is rooted in dynamical system theory. Systems, especially extended systems, have infinite degrees of freedom, yet dynamical behaviors are often governed by much fewer degrees of freedom. And also in the context of ecology, I think Holling was saying the same thing, but there is a mathematical basis for that. And I think the big challenge or the difficulty is to have the intuition of pointing on those fewer degrees of freedom that determines the dynamics. What are the important processes? What can we throw out as a first approximation, and what we cannot, in order to understand the behavior of a given system under given circumstances. I mean, this is all context dependent. It's not cannot be general.
I mean, we are gonna, I right now in Oklahoma are measuring on the order of 100,000 soil moisture measurements over kilometer scales. And I don't know how you guys sleep at night, not knowing the actual spatiotemporal distribution of soil water. I think these data, and we can put these things all over the place, these data are going to constrain your models.
Who told you we don't know how what is spatial temporal distribution of soil moisture? We cannot give it to you in Oklahoma. You are making an assumption there, my friend.
Well,
I think we can give you more than that. Well, I think we can give you a pretty good stochastic framework, a spatio-temporal for that distribution.
Well, maybe this is why I don't sleep as well at night as you do, because I don't believe it until I see it. I mean, I could sit there simulating like crazy, sure, but we don't know the topographic redistribution and the exact patterns and what the roots do to respond to those patterns and how that whole thing evolves. I mean, I don't believe that we yet can constrain our stochastic Hydrus 3D or whatever other models you want to put in there. When we get these data, you can believe we are going to constrain some models big time.
So one thing, I think we started with this dichotomy between simplistic and non-simplistic models and including how to include the data, etc. First of all, my approach would be we shouldn't think of experiments just as a way to get a parameter for a model. That doesn't do a good justice to all good experimental work that can be done. We should, many of these models are simplistic, but they can help us formulate some hypotheses that then can be used and be tested in the field. And this is what Gabi was alluding to. I think after more than 10 years of research in patterns just specific to dryland ecology, etc., we should just ask the question what we have learned and what type of hypotheses have these models generated. At this point, it becomes a good time to plan some global or some major initiative on the experimental side. And I agree with Ignacio that our life might be too short to see some of these, I hope not, but to see some results. So we can be strategic to see where somebody else has already made some experiments for us. For example, the boundary between the Negev and Egypt, there seems to be a big change in vegetation cover. So there we could learn some, and this is just an example, but there are so many fences around the world. An example of places where we can see the impact of a certain manipulation on the environment, on the formation of some patterns. And but basically my approach would be that first we should wonder, and probably, I don't know if we have time now, but what have we learned from these simplistic models, what type of hypotheses that we would like to then test in the field?
Okay, I think we need to close this interesting discussion. So maybe let's for one more question or comment and conclude. Yeah, please.
Going back to what we were talking about yesterday, I mean, this is a wonderful conversation. These conversations of what's your favorite variable are always fascinating because it flushes everybody out of their corners. But if we were to pull in 99.9999999% of the world into this room and tell them that what we really want to know is soil moisture or the residence time distribution, or what have you, they're going to shake their heads, because I think what most I see this gap between where this field is and where it could be, and I think it's a gap. It's a little bit of a gap of imagination, because I mean, the nature of the problems that face us right now seems so eco-hydrologic to me. And what people are going to be asking are questions like, you know, when are the trees going to die? When are the crops going to fail? Where are the pupfish going to go? You know, I mean, those are motivating questions with which that this community has a lot to offer. And somehow the challenge to me seems to be, how do you marry all the fundamental curiosity-driven ideas that we have and that we're all motivated by against these fundamental questions that are going to be asked of this community? And to me, that's the real challenge, and I hope we're up for it.
Okay, so this was a good conclusion. I will not attempt to summarize all what has been said here, but one conclusion is obvious, that such meetings are very helpful, and meetings that are interdisciplinary, and we should keep on with such meetings. And with that, I would like to conclude. And,
Thank you. Just to add a note of thanks from all of us, I'm sure I'm representing everybody at this moment, to the organizers of the meeting. It has been delightful, not only in terms of science, but also in terms of human companionship and sharing and fellowship. Thank you very, very much to all of the organizers.